This morning we're going to be looking at Psalm 107. It's the beginning of Book 5 of the Psalms, if you're flicking through. Not that it's hard to find a number, of course, but there we go, Psalm 107. And this psalm for me has a bit of a backstory. The first home group I was ever in, there was a wonderful lady in it called Eileen Hill. She had been a believer for almost all of her life. She was in her mid-80s when we got to know her, and I think we were about her 80th home group. I mean, she'd been in the church and different churches as she'd moved around for a long, long time. And one of the things that she loved to do, she wasn't very mobile. Her health meant that she couldn't get out and about very much, but she saved up her energy and she went to visit Spring Hill Prison. And she ministered to prisoners there. She would write to them, and then she'd go up occasionally and she'd go to their chapel services. And whenever she got a chance, she would preach on Psalm 107. In her version of the Bible, it was, "Let the redeemed of the Lord say so." It didn't say what, just said, "say so." If you've got a more modern translation, it might say, "Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story." But she would tell the 4 stories from this psalm, of which one of them has to do with prisoners in chains. And she would tell of the Lord's great power to redeem people out of all their trouble. And then afterwards she would chat to these prisoners, and lots of them called her Granny Eileen, and several of them wrote to her. And she would sit with them and she'd pray with them. And it was such an encouragement, certainly to me as a young believer, I imagine probably to you as well. I've talked about this lady many times before because she was also somebody who had a prayer map. She would sit in her lounge and pray her way around the room. I'm sure I've said this to a few people recently, with all these little objects that reminded her who she'd pray for next, and then who she'd pray for after that. So although she never left her lounge most days, her influence in the spiritual realm was spreading far beyond that lounge, because she trusted that God's ability to answer her prayers was greater than her ability to go out and do stuff. And in that, she was a great woman of faith. She used to reverse her age. So when she was 85, she always said she was 58. When she was 86, she would say she was 68. When she was 87, she'd say she was 78, and she passed away before she hit 88 and couldn't play the trick anymore. So she's now with the Lord, and she was a great encouragement. So let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story, Psalm 107. I'm going to read it all the way through. No apologies for that. It's a great psalm. Follow along if you would like to. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story, those he redeemed from the hand of the foe, those he gathered from the lands, from east and west, from north and south. Some wandered in desert wastelands, finding no way to a city where they could settle. They were hungry and thirsty, and their lives ebbed away. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He led them by a straight way to a city where they could settle. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind, for he satisfies the thirsty and fills the hungry with good things. Some sat in utter darkness, prisoners suffering in iron chains, because they rebelled against God's commands and despised the plans of the Most High. So he subjected them to bitter labor. They stumbled, and there was no one to help. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He brought them out of darkness, the utter darkness, and broke away their chains. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind, for he breaks down gates of bronze and cuts through bars of iron. Some became fools through their rebellious ways and suffered affliction because of their iniquities. They loathed all food and drew near the gates of death. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He sent out his word and healed them. He rescued them from the grave. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. Let them sacrifice thank offerings and tell of his works with songs of joy. Some went out on the sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths, and in their peril their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. Let them exalt him in the assembly of the people and praise him in the council of the elders. He turned rivers into a desert, flowing springs into thirsty ground, and fruitful land into a salt waste, because of the wickedness of those who lived there. And he turned the desert into pools of water, and the parched ground into flowing springs. There he brought the hungry to live, and they founded a city where they could settle. They sowed fields and planted vineyards that yielded a fruitful harvest. He blessed them, and their numbers greatly increased, and he did not let their herds diminish. Then their numbers decreased, and they were humbled by oppression, calamity, and sorrow. He who pours contempt on nobles made them wander in a trackless waste, but he lifted the needy out of their affliction and increased their families like flocks. The upright see and rejoice, but all the wicked shut their mouths. Let the one who is wise heed these things and ponder the loving deeds of the Lord. Let the one who is wise heed these things and ponder the loving deeds of the Lord. This story, or these stories, they tell a bigger story, don't they? They tell a story of a people who find themselves in difficulty and then God rescues. And the psalmist parks it at the end by talking about the nation of Israel having sinned and decreased, but then God bringing them back. And that's the sort of the meta story here, if you like, the bigger story behind it all. But underneath that are individual stories of groups of people who find themselves in trouble and God rescues them. And the call in that is, so give praise. Tell the story. Let God get all the glory. And it's written on the basic assumption, and it's a truth, it's not a wrong assumption, that everybody has a story to tell of God's goodness, God's deliverance. Like I was saying before, many of us even have stories that go back before we knew the Lord, and yet we have a story of God's deliverance. I have a friend who I knew at youth group before I became a believer. Before he was a believer, he woke up one night in the process of falling out of a top bunk. And he woke as he fell. There was a metal cabinet on the floor right where his head would have hit. And as he fell, it was just a sort of a moment. He was frozen in time, and he realized that he was going to hit his head against that at full pelt. And then the next thing, he was on the floor, and somehow he'd shifted down. His feet were beyond the end of the bed. There's no way he could have landed like that. He has no idea other than that the Lord delivered him. Now, that's a tiny story. And you might say, well, it was in the middle of the night and he was asleep, and how does he know? But for him, he's certain that in that moment, the Lord rescued him. What's your story? That's what we're going to be thinking about today. What is your story of God's goodness? What is your story of God's deliverance? And just before we go there, I'm aware that there's an obstacle that many of us will have in thinking about what's our story. And that obstacle is, what about the stories where God hasn't delivered us? And that can be the thing that hinders us from being confident with what God has done. So I want to give us 3 lenses to look at God's non-deliverance, if you like, through, which I believe help us. These are not the only things that could be going on, but I think they are helpful ways of thinking about what might be going on in the times where it feels like you have been calling out to God and he hasn't answered. The first one comes from the book of Exodus. In Exodus chapter 15, the people of God arrive at this place which they call Mara. The reason they call it Mara, which means bitter, is because the water there is bitter and they cannot drink it. And they call out to the Lord and they say, God, what are you doing? You brought us here to die in the desert. There's that repeated refrain, isn't there, throughout the Exodus. God, we know you rescued us, but did you just bring us here to kill us? And they called out and they grumbled and complained against the Lord. And Moses followed the Lord's instructions and threw a stick in and the water became sweet. But the very next thing that happened was they came around the corner, if you like, in the desert, to a place called Elim, where there were springs and palm trees for shade. They were just around the corner from God's provision. But they grumbled and said, God, have you brought us here to kill us? I want to say sometimes we're calling out to God and we're saying, God, why is it that you have not broken through in this situation? Why is it you have not delivered me? And the answer is he's about to. And he's just saying, just be patient a few more days. Or maybe because the Lord is the Lord and to him a day is like 1,000 years, maybe it's a few more years. That's not an easy thing to hear. But sometimes the reason that we don't see God's deliverance is because he's saying, in time, stay faithful, trust me. I didn't bring you here to kill you in the desert. One lens. Lens two, sometimes the ongoing situation is a learning and growing experience. So Caroline and I have some friends who are in fairly early stages of marriage. It's not somebody from the fellowship, so you don't have to start guessing. And they're juggling different jobs, change of life pattern, and a whole bunch of other pressures. And in the midst of that, their house is just a wreck. I mean, I don't think ours is always very pretty, but there are piles of clothes everywhere, washing up, not done. And a couple of times they've appealed to us and just said, please help us. and we've showed up and we've blitzed the house with them and with some of their relatives or friends. But actually, after that, and Caroline was the one who prompted me to do this, she said, we can help out like that, but what we really need to do is sit down and say, what are you going to learn that's going to help you to stay on top of this? And actually, there's a learning and a growing which is not helped by us just fixing it. And not that we can't be there every week anyway, but if we could, that wouldn't be the best for them because they wouldn't learn and they wouldn't grow. And sometimes the reason that God doesn't just break through and fix it all for us, even though we're calling out to him to do that, is because he says there's something for you to learn here. Now, I think this can be overdone. I think sometimes we're in trouble and somebody can put an arm around you and say, well, look, it's just God teaching you something, so you better learn it, hadn't you? It's not like that. We mustn't second guess what God is up to, but we can ask him. Paul was troubled by this thorn in the flesh, and he called out to God and he said, take it away. 3 times he said, take it away, please, Lord. And God said, no, listen, my grace is sufficient for you, and my strength is made perfect in your weakness. Paul could have been proud. God allowed him to remain humble. God taught him humility through an ongoing situation that he did not deliver him from, as far as we know. Certainly not at the time that 2 Corinthians was written. So, perhaps deliverance is underway. Perhaps there's learning to be done in the ongoing situation. The third lens I want to throw out there is sometimes God doesn't deliver us because the suffering of the situation we're in, the difficulty of the situation we're in, is part of the call. Paul talks about, and it's a mysterious turn of phrase, but I think we can get at what he means. He talks about filling up in his body what is still lacking in regard to Christ's afflictions. Now, we know he can't mean that Jesus' work on the cross was incomplete. Jesus' work on the cross was complete. He suffered for our sins, but there is an ongoing suffering that the people of God go through as the kingdom of God comes fully. It's the suffering of the martyrs who die because they are faithful witnesses of an unpopular message. It's the ongoing suffering of those who speak out against the zeitgeist and say, this is not right, even though everybody around says it's right, because the scriptures say it's not right. It's not how God is, and as a result, they're marginalized or excluded or lose their jobs. It's those whose families disown them or who experience distance from friends because of the message. It's those who go to the lowest places and work in poverty and difficult conditions to see God's love come to those people. If you'd gone to Mother Teresa as a good, well-known example in the slums of Calcutta and said, God wants to deliver you out of this, she'd said, no, this is God's call. The suffering is part of it. It's not something to be delivered of. It's part of what it is to be God's suffering people in the world. So, if when you hear people talk about testimony, your first response is, yes, but, or you start to get excited and then you think, but how can I really stand there and say, God delivers people out of their trouble when he hasn't delivered me out of this trouble, or when he hasn't delivered my friend out of their trouble? If that comes to your mind, I want to encourage you. Then there are other lenses that may be helpful, but these three may be good ones. Maybe God is in the process of doing it or about to do it, and he's asking us to be faithful and remember. Maybe he wants us to learn and grow through it. And maybe that suffering is part of his call on our lives. Three possible lenses. This psalm then gives us a way to tell the story. Because these stories are not about how great the wanderer in the desert was. He did brilliantly. He was wandering in the desert and he found his way. It's not Bear Grylls. This is the glory of the Lord. This is what the Lord has done. So at the end of your rows, certainly the front two rows, and there's probably enough for everybody else as well, there are some sheets of paper that look like this. Karen, you've got your row. Caroline, you've got yours. Sarah, I think they're next to yours. If you could try and have, ideally one each, and if there's not enough, it was hard to know how many people. I didn't want to destroy an entire rainforest for the printing. If there's not enough, then maybe couples could share one between two. How are we doing? Wave a hand if you've got spares. Okay. Thank you. There we go. While we're at it, you will be needing pens. Does anybody not have a pen? Wave a hand. You know what's going to happen? I'm going to try and throw them onto it. It's going to go badly wrong. Sorry? I'm not going to hit you with a pen. There's a pen. If I throw some onto that chair, then I won't maim anybody in the process. Anybody else need a pen that doesn't have one? Roz, yep. Okay, now there's lots of ways to tell a story, and our kids at primary school, they learned about story arcs and story mountains, and they would learn how to tell a story using these illustrations. I didn't learn that at school. We did read a lot of stories, but one way that you can tell a testimony, and it's a very powerful way, and it's a way that very easily points to God, is these 5 stages, which I've made begin with the letter C, so that you can remember them all. The crisis, the call, the coming, the character, and the courage. And we're going to look at those as we go through, but it starts off with the crisis. Now, there's 4 crises in this psalm. What are the 4 crises? I can't hear, I'm sorry. Ships in a storm. Foolish, yes, foolish and wasting away. Prisoners, and what's the first one? Desert wastes. Yeah, okay, so desert wastes, high seas, wasting away, foolishness, slightly obscure that one, and the last one. What did I miss? In prison. There we are, in prison. And look, there's a few things about these crises. First of all, some of them are clearly the person's fault, and some of them do not appear to be that person's fault. And I want to say, when you're talking about things that the Lord has done for you, both of those are valid. Times when God delivers you from something that wasn't your fault, but times where you got yourself into some trouble and the Lord rescued you out of that. I know I have told stories like that from this lectern before now, and in some ways those are the most powerful because it can't be about us. It can't be about how good we are, because it starts off with our utter failure, our inability to even stay on the straight and narrow. And we ended up in this situation. And God, some of these are, well, these are all physical descriptions, but they all have a sort of, if you like, a spiritual or metaphorical meaning you could also draw out of them. And I think that's deliberate. Because God did draw people back from the nations, and therefore there were people who were wandering around in the desert, lost. And there were people who went out on the seas, even though Israel wasn't a seafaring people. And there were people who were imprisoned in foreign nations and so on. But also, these things speak of ongoing spiritual things that happen to us, don't they? We have a friend who used to live in this area who, on the face of things, appeared to have the perfect life. She'd always wanted to be married and have children. She had those things. She lived in a beautiful house not far from here. And she would wake up in the night weeping because her life was empty. She was alone in a desert waste, if you like, desperate for a city, desperate for water. She found that through going on an Alpha course, and she found Jesus, the one who brings living water. But her life was empty and dry and lonely. That's the desert waste, if you like, isn't it? When Caroline and I were involved in student work, there was a girl who we knew who was in chains to an eating disorder, and it sapped her of life physically and spiritually and mentally. You know, her brain was not functioning at top capacity. Her body certainly wasn't. She was bound up in chains. They weren't physical chains. They were chains in her mind and in her soul. God delivered her out of those, although it was a long walk, wasn't it? The one who's a fool and whose life is ebbing away, they're wasting away. This could be a picture of somebody who is addicted to something they know is not bringing them life. Gambling, pornography, alcohol, whatever it might be, even bitter thoughts. And those lead you down to the grave. And it's something that we need to be delivered from. And who here hasn't ever felt out of control and buffeted on the high seas of life? I suspect it's very few of us haven't at some point felt that, if nothing else, during the 2.5 years of the worst of the pandemic, when we suddenly realized there was no sense of control over our lives at all. And we were all buffeted about on the high seas. And what did the Lord do in those times? So these are physical situations, and your story might be a physical situation, but your story might also be a spiritual situation, which is akin to one of these in a metaphorical way or in a spiritual way. So I want to ask, what's your crisis? What would be the one you would tell? What's obviously the common factor about all these crises is that they're one in which the person calls out to the Lord. So that's the first part of your testimony. What's the crisis in which you called out to the Lord? I actually want to give you a moment now of private reflection. If you really feel the need to externally process, then do chat quietly to the person next to you. But ideally, this is about you just taking a moment and saying, Lord, what would be one of those crises that you have met me in, where I've called out to you? How would I describe it to somebody who wasn't me, who wasn't inside my head? So we're going to take 3 or 4 minutes now. Have a think. What would be the crisis that you would tell people about? There's no crisis too small or seemingly insignificant, and there's none that's too big either. So see if you can write something down in that red box at the top under the crisis. And we'll take 3 minutes from now. Almost everybody's done writing, so I'm going to move on. Feel free to keep writing if that's what you, if you're doing that still at the moment. This is the crisis in which people found themselves. This is the call in which people call out and say, God, please help me. You'll notice not much is said about the call. It's just they called out to the Lord, because it's not about them. It's not that they called out to the Lord with a clever prayer. They called out to the Lord, and because they were such people of faith, God did it. It's just they called out to the Lord. That's when we're telling what God's done for us, it doesn't need to major on what we did. It's what he did. They called out to the Lord, and what happened? This is where the focus is. God breaks in. I've called this the coming, because God turns up in power. God does something on behalf of his people. Isaiah, when he's prophesying, he says this wonderful turn of phrase, which it's profound, and yet it doesn't always strike us as profound when we first read it. He says, in the whole history of the world, there has never been a God like you who acts on behalf of his people. And then you pause and you think, actually, that's true. The people of the time had these pet gods who you could bargain with, the household gods, if you like. And world religions have gods who set rules that you must obey and ways that you must live. But the God that we know is a God who intervenes on behalf of his people, not because they bargained with him or done the right things, but because he loves them and he made them and they're his children and he desires good things for them and he wants to deliver them and he wants them to grow up and be good, grown-up children of the King. And this is the God that we know. He acts on behalf of his people. He comes to help us. He breaks in. The wanderer is led by a road to a city where he can settle. That's the first resolution. The prisoner is broken out of their chains, just like I shared about our student friend who was broken out of that eating disorder, which was all-consuming. If you've not ever interacted with somebody seriously who has that kind of eating disorder, it can consume your entire mindset. Your entire day can be lived out in this relationship of love and hate with food and with eating and with what you look like. It can consume everything, and you can be bound up in chains, and God delivered her. It was glorious. It is glorious. It's just such a joy just seeing her any time now and knowing that she just carries herself differently. There's a life from inside, and there's a contentedness with how things are, and she's now serving other people, and that it's just a joy. And there's a testimony of God right there. To the one who's wasting away, God speaks just a word and they're healed. And to the person who's on the high seas, God speaks and the storm is stilled. And of course we have the most beautiful example of that happening very literally with Jesus and his disciples. In fact, it happens twice, doesn't it? Because there's the time that he's sleeping in the boat and the storm's raging all around, and they say, "Don't you care? We're going to die. Wake up, Jesus, wake up." And he wakes up and he says, "Quiet, be still." And the waves and the wind die down. There's that time, but there's also the time that they're rowing against the wind on the high seas, and he walks to them across the water, and they're afraid that he's a ghost. And he says, "Take courage, it's I." And then they welcome him into the boat, and not only does the wind die down, but immediately they arrive at their destination, John says. God did it once, God does it again. God breaks in on behalf of his people. And when I say God did it once, he'll do it again. You'll notice what each of these stories does, or a couple of them in particular. So, people are wandering in desert wastelands. They call out to the Lord. He delivers them. He leads them to a city. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love, his wonderful deeds for mankind. Why? He satisfies the thirsty and he fills the hungry with good things. Now, you'll see there's the crisis, and then there's the calling out to God. God intervenes, and out of that, the psalmist, the testifier, draws this conclusion. It's not just that God helped that person in that situation, but it's because God is like this. He is the kind of God who satisfies the hungry with good things and gives the thirsty water to drink. That's the kind of God that he is. He breaks the prisoners out of trouble. Let them give thanks to the Lord, for he breaks down gates of bronze. He cuts through bars of iron. Do you doubt that God is powerful? Now remember, when the Psalms are written, iron is about the hardest thing you can get. God breaks through bars of iron, just like that. After the last of the four stories, the psalmist elaborates on God's character. God is the God who dries up water where people are unfaithful, but he meets the needy in their affliction. He can turn a desert into springs because he's the Lord. He can bring refreshment. So do you see, they go from the story in which this is what happens, this is the calling out, this is what God does. They go from that story into, because this is what God is like, and a general truth about God is stated. These are the kind of truths that you get in Exodus 34. The Lord, the gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin, but not leaving the guilty unpunished. These are eternal truths about God's character. They're true then when God said them. They're true in the story of these people that the psalmist's talking about. They're true in your life. They're true in my life. They're true in the testimonies of thousands and thousands and thousands of believers alive today and in the past. This is where the testimony is going. This is why the last stage is the courage, because having talked about the character of God, why do we testify? In the book of Revelation, John asks about these mysterious figures under the altar. And, who are these who are crying out, "How long, Lord?" And John says, those are the ones who gave their lives for me. They overcame by the word of their testimony and the blood of the Lamb. You see, Jesus' power and our testifying to his power are what changed the world. He could have just changed it all himself, but he has given us the job of testifying to who he is and telling people what he's like, and he's given us the privilege of using our own stories to be part of that as well. So we can tell what God has done, and we can say he's still doing it today because Jesus is alive. Jesus is not dead. He isn't a story or a myth about something that was written 2,000 years ago. Jesus is alive today. He's changing lives today. He's changed my life, and he can change your life. This is the purpose of testimony. It tells people what God is like, and it encourages them that it's true for them too. And that's useful within the church because sometimes we need reminding of what God's like. We can lose sight of what he's like. We can become discouraged. We can become jaded. We can be blind to what he is like. And sometimes we need somebody to put an arm around the shoulder and say, listen, I realize this is hard. And I'm not being sort of glib about this, but listen, God did this for me. And it's reminded me that this is true about God. And it's true for you as well. So let's pray. Keep going. Don't give up. And it's true outside the church, because there are people who don't even know that there is a loving God, let alone that Jesus died on the cross for them, that he has not given up on them, that he doesn't hold them at arm's length because they've sinned, because that's my story. I sinned against God, and it wasn't when I got my life together that God drew close to me. He drew close to me in my sin while I was still a sinner. Christ died for me, therefore it's true for you as well. You don't have to get your life tidied up before you can come to God. Now, how many of you have had that conversation with somebody? God wouldn't be interested in me, or God, I've messed up too badly. I know I've had that with a number of people. Any others? Yeah, there's a few hands, a few nods. Yeah. Or I'm not the religious type. Anyone had I'm not the religious type? I wasn't the religious type. But I found out that it was true. And once I found out it was true, it didn't matter whether I was a religious type or not, because Jesus is alive. Here's what he's done in my life. Do you see the power of testimony here? Somebody can argue with facts and say, oh, well, you say that the resurrection makes sense factually because of this and this and this, but I don't think I agree with you on that. And they're entitled to their opinion, even though actually the resurrection is incredibly well attested as fact. But what they can't argue with is God did this in my life, and he can do it in yours. So what's your story? What's your crisis in which you called out to the Lord and he came and delivered you? And from that, what does it tell you about God's character? So I didn't pre-prep this. That wouldn't be fair. I was thinking at the same time as you about what would my crisis be. I thought one which would probably make sense for the audience we're in here I wouldn't necessarily make this one that I'd talk to somebody outside the church about, was from early days as a student minister, if you like. Didn't really use that phrase, but anyway, student worker, should we call it. And I'd only recently moved out of IT. I'd planned to become a part-time assistant pastor, and then our student workers just burned out, and we were asked at very last minute, off the back of Florence just having been born as well, would we take on leading the student work? And we had the student weekend away coming up, and I was trying to get up to speed with student work and what we were going to do at our student weekend away. And those of you who know me well will know organisation, not my strong point, especially organisation of events. So all of that was going on, and I just about got my hand on all of that, and suddenly I thought, well, I need to lead worship, which I don't do, and I need to decide what I'm actually going to talk about for this weekend, because I've managed to get everything practically sorted out now, but where are we going to go together? And I was counting down the hours until we needed to drive away, and I was saying, Lord, I need something. And I can talk about what you're like, but I need something that's going to inspire these young people to live for you. What's it going to be? I don't even know them well enough to know where they're at. So you're going to have to help me with that. And I found myself listening to these two tracks almost on repeat, both actually based around the idea of the storm and the seas and meeting God in them. One of them is called Oceans, which is talking about being called out on the water as Peter was called out to walk on the waves. Another one called In Over My Head, about encountering God in a way that is not in our control, but is about his sovereignty and our humanity. And as those songs went on repeat, God started to inspire something in me about calling to God, about calling to him and saying, ask me and I'll walk out on the water. That was the message that we ended up at that church weekend. It was all about stepping out of the boat. In that moment, even though I was empty, God was at work in people. Somebody gave their life to the Lord at that student weekend because God spoke to them and called them to step out of the boat and actually take a step of faith. Others were called up to live more fully for God. It wasn't my message. It wasn't something that I'd cooked up in, 4 weeks of preparation time. It was my desperation and God's power. Do you know what God's like? God doesn't allow those who trust in him to be put to shame. That would be my character thing from that. God's so faithful that nobody whose hope is in him will ever be put to shame. I was desperate. I was empty. God didn't allow me to be put to shame. He did something good out of my emptiness. So, as you think about your story, as you think about your crisis, you calling out to God, what God did, I want to encourage you, there's a kind of a 3 parts of what God did. Here's what God did, here's what he's like, and then there's the application. So this is what he's like to you as well. What I want to encourage you to do now, ask you to do even, is in a minute to find yourselves in groups that you feel comfortable with. I think a good group for this would be 2 or 3. If you're a very private person, you might find that there's just one other person that you'd like to do this with, and that's okay. Go and find them. Some of you may be more gregarious and think 4 or 5 would be fine. That's all good. But what I want to do is to ask you to explain to somebody else, because we can have it clear in our heads, and it doesn't always come out clearly. So explain to somebody else, this was the crisis, and I called out to God, here's what he did, and then to talk out with him, because this is what he's like. And you might find as you do that, okay, I'm saying, here's what God's like. He doesn't allow those whose hope is in him to be put to shame. One of you might say to me, that's not all he did, is it? It's also that he won't allow people to go on being lost. That girl who put her faith in Jesus that day, that was actually far more valuable than me not being put to shame. So you could say it's not just that he doesn't allow those whose hope is in him to be put to shame. It's also that he calls the lost to himself. That's what God's like. And we know that's true, don't we? So as you tell your story and you say, this is what God did, here's what that shows me about God, I want to encourage others of you in that group to say, and also this, have you thought about that? And let's see if you can find 3 or 4 things that crisis tells you about God's character. And maybe you'll find in that process that you are actually encouraging each other. But whether or not you do, you are going to have opportunities in the next couple of weeks to talk about things that God has done in your life. And I want to encourage you to rehearse this one in your head. Now, I say very confidently you're going to have an opportunity in the next couple of weeks. I think most of us have opportunities most weeks to tell a story to somebody. And if this is genuinely a story that's happened to us, it's a natural one to share. But I also think God is the kind of God who loves to give people opportunities when they seek it. So I'm all the more confident than I would normally be that you'll have an opportunity in the next couple of weeks to tell this story. And when that opportunity comes up, you'll be ready because you've thought about it. So what has God done in your life? How has he come through? What does it say about his character? His eternal character and nature. Do you know what? That can be true for you as well. We're going to have just shy of 10 minutes now, I think, probably, in groups. Just take that time to tell your bit of the story, talk about what God has done and what his character's like.